A little girl materialized from the mist, reaching out in a blind panic. She didn't beg for her own life. She begged for the man she loved most. "Don't hurt him! Save my dad!" The man she stopped held the power of life and death in his hands. He wasn't a savior. He was Park Jun-sok, the king of the Korean underworld, and the monsters in the forest are about to meet the devil himself. A line of black luxury sedans cut through the suffocating silence of the Korean highlands when a child in a torn pink dress collapsed in their path. She was bleeding, shaking, and desperate. She said the shadow men had taken her father into the trees to end him. The man who stepped into the damp earth was Park Jun-sok, one of the most feared men in the country. Surrounded by enforcers who represent nothing but violence, Jun-sok felt a flicker of something he thought was dead. Instead of ordering his drivers to move on, he stepped into the dark tree line. What he found there changed a simple rescue into a blood feud and gave a ruthless boss a reason to remember his soul. The mist didn't just sit among the trees, it breathed, a cold and damp lung that seemed to exhale directly into Jun-sok's lungs as he stepped off the asphalt. Behind him, the low, rhythmic thrum of the idling luxury sedans faded into a ghostly hum. He didn't look back at his men. He didn't have to. The heavy, synchronized click of 4 car doors closing told him everything he needed to know. His enforcers were moving into their flank positions, shadows blending into a darker forest. "This way! Please hurry!" Ha-rin's voice was a thin, jagged wire of desperation. She stumbled over a protruding root, her small hands catching her fall in the black mud. But she didn't cry out. She was already back on her feet, the hem of her pink dress snagged on a briar, ignoring the thorns that scraped her shins. Jun-sok followed with a deliberate, predatory grace. His handmade Italian shoes, worth more than most men earned in a year, sank into the rotting leaves without a sound. He watched the back of the girl's head, noting the way her hair was matted with pine needles and dried sweat. She was a pulse of vibrant, terrified color in a world of monochrome gray. As we moved deeper, the air grew thick with the scent of wet cedar and something sharper, the metallic tang of old grease and the acrid bite of cheap cigarettes. Jun-sok raised a single hand, a silent command that froze the enforcers behind him. He stepped closer to Ha-rin, placing a heavy, gloved hand on her shoulder. She flinched, her wide eyes darted up at his face, but the absolute stillness in his gaze seemed to anchor her. He pressed a finger to his lips. He leaned forward, parting a curtain of low-hanging hemlock branches. There, in a natural clearing where the fog pooled like milk, were the shadow men. There were 3 of them, dressed in tactical jackets that bore no insignia, though Jun-sok recognized the aggressive, undisciplined slouch of the Han-Gil syndicate. They were city dogs trying to play wolf in the woods. In the center of the clearing, forced onto his knees, was a man who looked like a hollowed-out version of the person Jun-sok once knew. This was Ha-rin's father. His face was a map of bruises, one eye swollen shut, his hands zip-tied behind a rusted iron stake driven into the earth. One of the enforcers, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, laughed as he thumbed the hammer of a semi-automatic pistol. He pressed the cold muzzle against the back of the father's neck. "You thought you could just walk away, Kang?" the gunman sneered, his voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. "You thought the chairman would just forget the debt because you wanted to play house with a brat in the mountains? There's only one way out of the syndicate, and it's 6 feet deep." Beside Jun-sok, Ha-rin trembled so violently he could feel it through the layers of his wool coat. She opened her mouth to scream, a sob building in her chest that would have alerted every bird in the forest. Before the sound could escape, Jun-sok's hand moved with lightning speed, cupping her mouth. He leaned down, his lips brushing the shell of her ear. His voice was a sub-zero whisper, devoid of heat or hesitation. "Don't close your eyes, little one. If you want him to live, watch what happens when people touch what belongs to me." Junsock didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He simply stepped out from the tree line, moving into the clearing with the casual confidence of a king walking through his own garden. The gunman with the scarred eyebrow spun around, his eyes widening as they landed on the tall, imposing figure in the charcoal overcoat. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the drip of water from the canopy. The thugs froze, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of Junsock's presence. In the underworld, Park Junsock was a myth, a nightmare spoken of in back rooms and high-rise offices. Seeing him here, in the middle of a nameless forest, was like seeing death itself manifest from the mist. Who the hell are you?" the gunman stammered, his bravado evaporating. Junsock didn't answer. He didn't have to. He simply looked at the man's finger on the trigger, his gaze so heavy with promised violence that the gunman's hand began to shake. "You're on the wrong side of the mountain," Junsock said, his voice as smooth as polished stone, "and you've made the mistake of making a child cry in my presence." The two other thugs reached for their waistbands, their movements clumsy and panicked. Junsock didn't flinch. He just waited for the first shadow to move, the internal clock of a killer counting down the seconds until the forest floor would be stained a much darker shade than mud. He could feel Hareen watching from the brush, her hope and her terror balanced on the edge of his next breath. The peace of the forest was over. The reckoning had begun. The standoff lasted only as long as it took for the lead gunman to realize he was breathing his last moments of borrowed time. The air in the clearing, once heavy with the scent of damp pine, suddenly crackled with a lethal electricity. Junsock didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need to. He was the conductor of a silent orchestra, and his baton was a simple, barely perceptible nod. From the periphery of the fog, the world exploded into calculated motion. There were no shouts, no cinematic warnings. The first sound was the muffled thwip-thwip of suppressed firearms, a sound less like a gunshot and more like the snapping of a dry twig. The thug to the left of the father crumpled instantly, a single red bloom appearing precisely in the center of his forehead before he even realized his hands had left his waistband. The scarred gunman, the one who had been so bold with his threats moments ago, let out a strangled yelp and tried to swing his pistol toward Junsock. He was too slow. A shadow detached itself from the hemlocks, Mateo, Junsock's lead enforcer, moving with a speed that defied his massive frame. Mateo's hand clamped onto the gunman's wrist, the sound of splintering bone echoing through the trees. The pistol fell into the mud, and before it hit the ground, a blade had already found the soft tissue beneath the gunman's jaw. The third man attempted to flee, diving into the brush, but he didn't make it 5 steps. 2 more of Junsock's men appeared from the mist like vengeful ghosts, their movements synchronized and cold. They didn't use bullets for the runner, they used the efficiency of their hands, bringing him to the ground with a rhythmic brutality that ended in a sickening silence. The violence was over in less than 12 seconds. It was a surgical erasure, a demonstration of power so absolute that it felt less like a fight and more like a law of nature being enforced. Junsock stepped over the body of the scarred gunman, his overcoat brushing against the dead leaves. He reached the father, who was still trembling on his knees, his face pressed into the dirt in anticipation of a bullet that never came. With a flick of a switchblade, Junsock severed the zip ties. "Stand up," Junsock commanded. The man groaned, his muscles seizing as he tried to find his footing. Junsock reached out, grasping the man's shoulder to steady him. As the man finally lifted his head, wiping the blood and grime from his good eye, the breath caught in Junsock's throat, a sensation so rare it felt like a physical blow. Beneath the bruises and the years of hard living was a face from a lifetime ago, a face from the gutters of Seoul before the luxury cars and the charcoal overcoats. Min-ho? Jun-sok whispered, the name tasting like ash and old memories. The man froze, his gaze locking onto Jun-sok's. A flicker of recognition pierced through the pain. Jun-sok? Is it really you?
Jun-sok looked at the man he had once shared a single bowl of rice with in an alleyway 20 years ago. Min-ho had been the only one who didn't betray him when the streets got cold. He was the one who had disappeared, choosing a life of obscurity over the beckoning call of the syndicate. Jun-sok had thought him dead, another casualty of the city's appetite for the poor. "You stayed away," Jun-sok said, his voice dropping into a low, mournful register. "You were supposed to be the lucky one, Min-ho. You were supposed to be free." "I was," Min-ho rasped, his voice breaking, "until they found me, until they saw what I had." A small pink blur suddenly burst from the tree line. Harin threw herself at her father, her small arms wrapping around his neck with such force they nearly toppled him. She wailed, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief that seemed to pierce the very heart of the fog. Jun-sok watched them, the broken father and the desperate daughter, and felt the weight of his empire pressing down on him. The enforcers stood at the edge of the clearing, their faces as expressionless as stone masks, waiting for the next order. They didn't see a reunion, they saw a liability. But Jun-sok looked at the girl's torn dress and her father's shattered face, and he saw the ghosts of the boys they used to be. The cold mercy he had intended to show was shifting into something far more dangerous, a debt of honor. "Mateo," Jun-sok called out, not looking away from the pair. "Yes, boss?" "Clean this up. Not a trace of these dogs remains in this forest," Jun-sok said, his eyes hardening as he looked toward the road where his convoy waited. "And prepare the safe house. We aren't going back to the city yet. We have a debt to settle with the Hangil syndicate." He looked down at Harin, who was staring up at him through tear-filled eyes, clutching her father's hand as if it were the only anchor in a storm. Jun-sok reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean silk handkerchief, offering it to her. "Don't cry anymore," he said, the ice in his voice cracking just enough for a sliver of warmth to show. "I told you I would save him, and Park Jun-sok always finishes what he starts." The convoy moved like a silent black serpent, winding its way out of the damp forest and into the higher reaches of the granite peaks. Inside the lead sedan, the air was heavy with the scent of leather and the sterile chill of the climate control, a stark contrast to the smell of blood and wet earth clinging to Min-ho's clothes. Harin sat wedged between her father and the door, her small hand white-knuckled as she gripped his arm. She didn't look at Jun-sok, who sat across from them in the shadows of the rear cabin, his face illuminated only by the rhythmic flash of the mountain tunnels. They passed through a series of reinforced steel gates that seemed to melt into the rocky hillside, guarded by men whose posture was as rigid as the stone around them. This was the hidden estate, a fortress of glass, cedar, and cold steel perched on a cliffside overlooking the mist-filled valley. To the outside world, it was a masterpiece of modern architecture. To those who knew Jun-sok, it was the center of a silent storm. As the cars came to a halt in a courtyard paved with smooth river stones, the doors were opened by enforcers who didn't offer smiles, only a chilling professional efficiency. Jun-sok stepped out first, his overcoat snapping in the high-altitude wind. He waited for Min-ho to climb out, noting the way his old friend winced as his feet hit the ground. "The second floor is yours," Jun-sok said, his voice level and devoid of the warmth that had flickered in the forest. "There is a medical suite prepared. My personal doctor will be here within the hour. Do not leave the floor without an escort." Min-ho looked up at the towering walls of the estate, his eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude and growing unease. "It's beautiful, Jun-sok, but it feels heavy." "Safety has a weight, Min-ho."
Junsok replied. His gaze shifted to Ha-rin. The girl was staring at a massive, floor-to-ceiling glass window that revealed a manicured Zen garden, its sand raked into perfect concentric circles. It was beautiful, but there was something suffocating about its perfection. Food and clothes have been provided. Rest, you are no longer in the forest. Inside, the estate was a labyrinth of silent hallways and soft lighting. Every corner was monitored by discrete cameras. Every door required a biometric scan that only Junsok's inner circle possessed. Ha-rin walked on the plush silk rugs as if she were walking on eggshells, her eyes wide as she took in the priceless porcelain vases and the cold, abstract art that adorned the walls. They were led to a suite that was larger than the entire cabin they had fled. The beds were covered in high thread-count linens, and the windows offered a panoramic view of the mountains, a view that was obscured by reinforced, bulletproof glass. On a mahogany table sat a tray of warm food and a new dress for Ha-rin, a soft lavender silk that looked like a flower compared to the shredded pink rags she still wore. Ha-rin reached out to touch the fabric, but pulled her hand back at the last second, looking at the two enforcers standing like statues outside their door. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, quiet room. "Are we safe now?" Minho sat on the edge of the bed, his head bowed. He looked at the cameras tucked into the corners of the ceiling, then back at his daughter. "We're safe, Ha-rin. Mr. Park is an old friend. He's powerful. But why do the men have guns if we're friends? And why can't we go outside to see the garden?" Minho didn't have an answer. He looked out the window at the mist rolling over the cliffs, realizing that while the shadow men were gone, they had been replaced by a much larger shadow. Below, in his private study, Junsok stood before a wall of monitors. He watched the black and white feed of the second-floor suite, seeing Minho collapse into a chair and Ha-rin finally pick up the lavender dress. He watched the way she looked at the door, her expression one of a bird that had been moved from a wooden trap to a golden one. Mateo entered the room, his footsteps silent on the hardwood. "The perimeter is secure, boss, but the Hangil Syndicate is already asking questions. They know someone intervened in the forest. They don't know it was us yet, but they will." Junsok didn't turn around. He watched Ha-rin on the screen. She had walked to the window and pressed her small forehead against the cold glass, looking out at the world she could no longer touch. "Let them ask," Junsok said, his reflection in the monitor looking as sharp and unforgiving as a blade. "I want them to wonder. I want them to feel the walls closing in, just as Minho felt them in that clearing." "And the girl?" Mateo asked. "She's a distraction. You're changing the schedule for her." Junsok finally turned, his dark eyes fixed on his lieutenant. "She isn't a distraction, Mateo. She is a reminder of the debt the world owes us. Ensure the guards understand. If so much as a shadow falls across that room that I did not authorize, they will answer to me personally." As Junsok dismissed his man, he sat in his high-backed chair, the silence of the estate pressing in on him. He had brought them here to save them, yet as he watched Ha-rin sit on the floor of her magnificent room, playing with a corner of the expensive rug, he realized the flaw in his mercy. He could provide her with silk and safety, but he could not give her back the forest without the monsters. He had invited the light into his fortress, only to realize his fortress was built for the dark. The sun had begun to dip behind the jagged peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows across the Zen garden. Junsok stood on the obsidian balcony, watching the silver mist crawl over the estate's perimeter walls. The silence of the house was absolute, a heavy, expensive quiet that usually served as his sanctuary. But today, the stillness felt fractured. He moved down the floating stone staircase, his steps silent.
He hadn't intended to visit the garden, but his monitors had shown a small, unmoving shape sitting near the koi pond. Ha-Rin was crouched on the raked white sand, her new lavender silk dress pooling around her like a fallen petal. She wasn't playing with the smooth river stones or watching the vibrant orange fish darting beneath the lily pads. She was simply staring at the high electrified fence that separated the manicured beauty of the estate from the wild, untamed forest beyond. As Junsok's shadow fell over her, she didn't flinch. She had grown used to the silent arrival of the men in black suits. "The sand is meant to stay in its patterns," Junsok said, his voice low but not unkind. "The monks believe it represents the flow of the world, constant and undisturbed." Ha-Rin looked up, her wide eyes reflecting the bruised purple of the twilight sky. "It looks like the ocean," she whispered. "But the ocean moves. This just stays still, like it's holding its breath."
Junsok remained standing, his hands deep in the pockets of his charcoal trousers. He looked at the child who had bridged the gap between his violent reality and the ghosts of his memory. Up close, the lavender silk made her look even more fragile, a stark contrast to the reinforced concrete and steel that surrounded them. "Your father is sleeping," Junsok said. "The doctor says he will be able to walk without pain in a few days." "Thank you, Mr. Park," she said, though her gaze drifted back to the fence. "Is this where you live? All by yourself?" "I have my men. I have my work." "But it's so big," she murmured, standing up and brushing the white dust from her knees. She took a tentative step toward him, stopping just outside the reach of his shadow. She studied his face with the terrifyingly blunt intuition of a child. "My dad says you're a king, but when I look at you, you look like the boy in my storybook who got lost in the cave." Junsok felt a phantom ache in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child hiding from the debt collectors in a damp basement in Busan. He tightened his jaw, his expression remaining a mask of cold indifference. "I am not lost, Ha-Rin. I know exactly where I am." Ha-Rin shook her head slowly, her dark hair swaying. She reached out, her small fingers hovering near his hand, though she didn't dare touch him. "Why do your eyes look so lonely?" she asked. The question hit with more force than any bullet ever had. In the underworld, people looked at Junsok with terror, greed, or a desperate, crawling respect. No one had ever looked at him and seen loneliness. To be lonely, one had to miss something, and Junsok had spent 20 years convincing himself he missed nothing and no one. "Loneliness is a luxury I don't have," he replied, his voice regaining its sharp professional edge. "In my world, being alone is the only way to be safe." "That's a sad way to be safe," Ha-Rin said softly. She looked toward the house, where the lights were beginning to flicker on, amber glows against the cold blue glass. "When I was in the woods, I was so scared, but I wasn't lonely because I knew I was running for my dad. Who do you run for, Mr. Park?" Junsok didn't answer. He couldn't. He looked past her, toward the dark tree line where the shadow men had tried to snuff out a life for $3,000. He thought of the empire he had built, the blood he had spilled to ensure no one could ever hurt him again, and realized that in building a world where he was untouchable, he had built a world where he was untouched. A cold wind swept down from the peaks, shivering the surface of the pond and sending a ripple through the lavender silk of Ha-Rin's dress. "It's getting cold," Junsok said, turning away to hide the crack in his composure. "Go back inside. The guards will show you the way." He didn't wait for her to move. He walked back toward the glass fortress, his heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He had saved her father from the forest, but as he stepped back into the sterile, monitored warmth of his study, the girl's question echoed in the silence. He sat at his desk and pulled up the security feeds. He watched Ha-Rin walk back into the house, a small dot of purple moving through the vast, empty halls. She stopped at the door to her father's room, looking back one last time toward the garden. Junseok switched off the monitors, plunging the room into darkness. He sat there for a long time, the king of the mountain, surrounded by his enforcers and his millions, realizing that for the first time in 2 decades, the silence of his home didn't feel like peace. It felt like an empty cave. The stillness of the estate was shattered not by a sound but by a vibration, the low, rhythmic pulse of a phone on a mahogany desk. Junseok did not reach for it immediately. He watched the rain begin to smear the mountain view, turning the valley into a watercolor of bruised blues and blacks. When he finally picked up the device, the caller ID showed a number that shouldn't have existed outside of the syndicate's deepest ledgers. Chairman Park. The voice on the other end was raspy, flavored with the arrogance of a man who believed he held a winning hand. It was Choi Sang-hoon, the leader of the Han-gil syndicate, a man who lacked Junseok's refinement but possessed double his cruelty. "Choi," Junseok replied, his voice a flat line of indifference. "You're calling my private line. That is a boundary you weren't authorized to cross." "And you crossed a tree line into a forest that wasn't yours," Choi countered, the sound of a lighter flicking audible through the speaker. "My men are dead, Park. 7 of them. Good earners, efficient cleaners. They were processing a debt, a small matter involving a runaway named Kang and his brat. And now, word is, they didn't just disappear. They were erased by black sedans. Your sedans." Junseok leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly in the silent room. "They were slovenly. They made a mess on a road I happened to use. I simply tidied up." "Tidying up is one thing, keeping the property is another." Choi's voice dropped, the playfulness vanishing into a growl. "Kang owes $3,000 in principal, but his true debt is the insult of leaving. He belongs to the Han-gil. His daughter belongs to the Han-gil. Give them back by midnight, and we can call the deaths of my men a logistical misunderstanding. Keep them, and you aren't just protecting a debtor, you're declaring war on every syndicate in the Northern District." Junseok looked at the security monitor. In the second-floor suite, Ha-Rin was sitting on the floor, painstakingly brushing her father's hair, while he sat in a daze, his bandaged hands resting in his lap. She was laughing at something, a small silver sound that didn't belong in a house built on bone and iron.
"A declaration of war over $3,000, Junseok mused, his eyes tracking the girl's movement. "You've always been cheap, Choi. That's why you'll never sit at the head of a high table." "It isn't about the money, and you know it," Choi barked. "It's about the precedent. If a stray can run to the great park Junseok and find sanctuary, my organization becomes a sieve. Give me the man and the girl, now." Junseok felt a cold clarity settle over him. He thought of Ha-Rin in the garden, asking why his eyes were lonely. He thought of Minho, the only boy who hadn't stolen his bread 20 years ago. If he handed them over, they would be dead before they reached the bottom of the mountain, but his empire would remain stable. If he kept them, he would be burning a bridge he had spent a decade building. He stood up, walking to the window. The reflection in the glass showed a man who had everything, yet was being asked to prove he still had a soul. "The girl asked me who I run for," Junseok said, seemingly to himself. "What?" Choi snapped. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I don't run for anyone, Choi," Junseok said, his voice turning into a serrated edge. "And I don't give back what I've decided to keep.
Min-ho Kang is no longer a debtor. He is a guest of the Park estate. As for the $3,000, Jun-sok paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Consider it the down payment on your funeral. He ended the call before Choi could respond. The silence that followed was different than the one before. It was the silence of a fuse that had already been lit. Mateo appeared in the doorway, his hand already resting on the grip of his sidearm. He had been listening on the extension. "You knew he wouldn't let it go," Mateo said. "The Han Gil will mobilize within the hour. They'll hit the transport routes first, then the mountain passes." "Let them," Jun-sok said, his gaze fixed on the monitor where Ha-rin was now hugging her father's neck. "They think they are fighting for a debt. They don't realize they are fighting for a ghost. Prepare the men. We aren't waiting for them to reach the gates." "And the girl?" Jun-sok watched Ha-rin pull a small lucky charm from her pocket, the one she'd been clutching in the fog, and place it in her father's hand. "Move them to the basement bunker," Jun-sok ordered. "Tell her it's a game. Tell her we're playing hide-and-seek from the storm. I don't want her to hear the sound of the world I'm about to break." As Mateo turned to execute the orders, Jun-sok picked up his charcoal overcoat. He felt the weight of the decision, a physical pressure against his ribs. He had spent his life avoiding middle grounds, and today he had finally found the one line he couldn't cross back over. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a guardian, and in his world, a guardian had to be more monstrous than the threat he was guarding against. He walked out of the study, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the hollow halls. The debt had been finalized, and the interest would be paid in blood. The transition from the quiet elegance of the estate to a theater of war happened with the silent, terrifying efficiency of a well-oiled machine. In the subterranean levels of the compound, the lights hummed with a clinical brilliance. There was no shouting, no cinematic bravado. There was only the metallic slide of bolts, the rhythmic clicking of magazines being seated into rifles, and the heavy thud of tactical vests being cinched tight. Mateo stood at the center of the armory, checking the sights on a customized suppressed carbine. Behind him, 3 other men, the same ones who had moved like ghosts through the forest, checked their secondary sidearms and adjusted their communications headsets. They were no longer just men in suits. They had transformed back into the apex predators of the syndicate, their expressions stripped of everything but the geometry of the coming engagement. Jun-sok entered the room, his presence immediately pulling the focus of every man in the space. He had shed his overcoat for a lightweight, bullet-resistant tactical jacket. He didn't carry a rifle. His weapon was the men standing before him and the strategic map glowing on the wall, showing the heat signatures of Choi Sang-hoon's approaching perimeter teams. "The Han Gil think they are coming for a debtor," Jun-sok said, his voice echoing in the sterile room. "They think they are coming for a man who has grown soft behind glass walls. We will not wait for them to reach the gate. We will intercept them at the pass. No survivors, no messages. If a single one of them returns to Choi, it will be because I allowed it." "Understood, boss," Mateo replied, his voice a low gravel. "We move in 5. Jun-sok nodded and turned, leaving the cold steel of the armory for the elevator. He ascended not to his study, but to the basement bunker, the reinforced heart of the mountain, where the air felt thick and still. Inside, the room was decorated to look like a high-end living area, but the lack of windows and the heavy, blast-proof door gave away its true purpose. Min-ho was sitting on a sofa, his head in his hands, while Ha-rin sat on the floor, sorting through a deck of cards the guards had given her. She looked up as the door hissed open, her eyes searching Jun-sok's face. "Is the storm coming?" she asked, her voice small. Jun-sok walked over to her, his heavy boots sounding out of place on the soft carpet. He knelt, an action that felt foreign to his body, and looked into her wide, expectant eyes. He saw the flicker of the same girl who had stopped his convoy in the fog, the one who had dared to hope when the world was hanging her father on a tree. "The storm is outside," Junseok said quietly, "but it cannot get in here. You are safe." He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out something small. It was a jade tiger, carved with such precision that every stripe seemed to vibrate with life. It was a relic of his own childhood, the only thing he had kept from the days before he had become a king of the dark. It was the token his mother had given him to keep him brave when the city tried to swallow them whole.
"This is a lucky charm," Junseok said, pressing the cool jade into her palm. "It has seen many storms. It has never failed." Hareen closed her fingers around the tiger, her eyes widening. "Is it magic?" "It is a reminder," Junseok replied, "that as long as you hold it, you aren't alone, and as long as you aren't alone, you cannot be defeated." He looked at Minho, a silent understanding passing between the two men. Minho saw the tactical gear, the hard line of Junseok's jaw, and the ghost of the boy who had once protected him in the alleys of Seoul. He gave a single, somber nod. Junseok stood up, his hand lingering for a fraction of a second on the top of Hareen's head, a gesture of affection he hadn't allowed himself in 20 years. "Stay with your father," he said. "When you wake up tomorrow, the sun will be over the peaks, and the fog will be gone." He turned and walked toward the door. As the heavy steel began to slide shut, he heard Hareen's voice one last time, thin but steady. "Be careful, Mr. Park. Don't let the shadow men get you." Junseok didn't look back. He couldn't. He stepped into the hallway where Mateo was waiting, the shadow of the Mafia boss once again swallowing the man who had just given away his only piece of luck. He felt the cold iron of his resolve settle back into place. "Mateo," he said, his voice turning into a weapon. "Boss? Kill them all." They moved toward the garage, the engines of the black sedans roaring to life like a pack of wolves awaking for the hunt. The war for Hareen's future had begun, and Junseok was ready to burn the mountain down to ensure she stayed safe in the dark. The mountain pass was a throat of narrow stone and suffocating mist, the perfect place for an ambush or an execution. Choi Sang-hoon's men had occupied a sprawling, rusted warehouse at the base of the ridge, a relic of the old logging industry that now served as a staging ground for their assault. They sat in the dim light of flickering halogen bulbs, checking their watches and boasting about the bounty on a dead man and a little girl. They didn't hear the sound of the wind changing. They didn't see the 3 black sedans drifting down the incline with their lights extinguished, gliding like sharks through deep water. Junseok stood on the ridge overlooking the structure, his silhouette carved out of the darkness. He held a pair of thermal binoculars to his eyes, watching the heat signatures move inside the corrugated metal walls. There were 12 of them, too many for a debt collection, just enough for a slaughter. "Positions," Junseok said into his comms. "North entry secure. Breach charges set." "South perimeter locked," another voice whispered. "They have no eyes on the tree line." Junseok descended the slope, his movements silent and lethal. He reached the rear loading dock just as the first breach charge detonated. The sound was a sudden, violent crack that tore through the mountain silence, followed immediately by the rhythmic, metallic rain of glass shattering. The warehouse doors vanished in a cloud of dust and fire. Before the echoes could fade, Junseok was inside. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of stacked shipping crates and heavy machinery. The Hangil thugs scrambled for their weapons, but they were fighting a ghost in a charcoal jacket. Junseok moved with a terrifying, unhurried grace. He stepped around a stack of timber just as a gunman turned the corner. Before the man could raise his rifle, Junseok's hand shot out, seizing the barrel and redirecting it toward the floor. In a single fluid motion, he drove a heavy palm into the man's throat and followed with a precise strike to the temple. The thug collapsed without a sound. Across the floor, the warehouse erupted in the thwip, thwip of suppressed fire.
Mateo and his team moved like a scythe through tall grass, clearing the mezzanine and the office clusters with surgical precision. This wasn't a battle, it was a reckoning. Junseok found himself in the center of the main floor, face to face with Choi's second in command, the man who had personally tightened the ropes on Min-ho in the forest. The man leveled a shotgun at Junseok, his face twisted in a mask of desperate rage. "You think you're a god, Park? You're just a man who's about to bleed." Junseok didn't dive for cover, he didn't flinch. He drew his sidearm, a sleek black executive pistol, and fired twice. The first round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around. The second found the center of his chest. Junseok walked toward the dying man, his boots crunching on the spent shell casings. "You made a mistake," Junseok said, his voice a low, terrifying vibration that cut through the dying groans of the warehouse. "You looked at a child and saw leverage. I looked at her and saw something you aren't allowed to touch." He fired one final finishing shot, then holstered his weapon. "Clear," Mateo said from the catwalks. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the smell of cordite and the cooling heat of the machinery. Junseok stood in the center of the carnage, his breathing steady, his eyes cold. He looked down at his hands. They were steady. He had spent his life building a wall of violence to protect himself, but tonight the violence felt different. It felt like a shield held over someone else's head. He walked to the far end of the warehouse where a small office sat perched above the floor. Inside he found the ledger, the physical evidence of the Hangil Syndicate's deaths. He didn't look for the $3,000. He found the page with Min-ho's name and tore it out. He pulled a silver lighter from his pocket and watched the paper curl into black ash. "Everything is gone, boss," Mateo said, appearing at the base of the office stairs. "The Hangil presence in this district has been neutralized. Choi is alone." "Then we are finished here," Junseok said. He walked out of the warehouse, leaving the ruins of the rival syndicate behind him. As he climbed back into the lead sedan, he looked toward the mountain where his estate sat, the golden cage where a little girl was waiting with a jade tiger clutched in her hand. He had ended the threat, but the weight of the night still sat heavy on his shoulders. He had saved the family, but in doing so, he had confirmed his own place in the dark. As the convoy began its ascent back into the mist, Junseok watched the warehouse burn in the rearview mirror. The shadow men were gone forever, and the debt was settled in full. Now there was only the final promise to keep. The heavy steel door of the bunker retracted with a low hydraulic hiss, admitting the sharp metallic scent of the night air. Junseok stood in the threshold, his tactical jacket gone, replaced by a fresh black suit that bore no evidence of the warehouse's carnage. He looked at Min-ho and Ha-rin, who were huddled together on the sofa. Ha-rin was fast asleep, her head resting on her father's lap, her small hand still curled tightly around the jade tiger. Min-ho looked up, his eyes searching Junseok's face for a verdict. He didn't ask if the men were gone. He knew the answer by the absolute funereal silence that had settled over the estate. "It's over," Junseok said, his voice echoing softly in the reinforced room. "The debt has been settled in full. The Hangil Syndicate no longer has a ledger with your name on it." Min-ho let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for years. "Thank you, Junseok. I don't know how I can ever—" "You can't," Junseok interrupted, stepping into the room. He held a thick, unmarked envelope in his hand. He placed it on the coffee table. Inside are 2 passports, different names, different histories. There is a deed to a small property in Jeju and enough currency to ensure Ha-rin never has to run through a forest again. By dawn, a private transport will take you to the coast. From there, you leave the mainland. Min-ho stared at the envelope as if it were a miracle or a curse. Jeju? That's hundreds of miles away. We'll be ghosts. That is the price, Junsok said, his gaze fixed on the sleeping girl. To the world, Minho Kang and his daughter died in the mountains tonight. If you stay, you are a liability. If you leave, you are free. But there is a condition. Minho nodded, his expression solemn. Anything. You never contact me. You never return to the city. You raise her in the sun, far from the shadows I inhabit. Junsok's voice wavered for the briefest of moments, before hardening back into stone. I am a man of the dark, Minho. To be near me is to be a target. This is the only way I can guarantee her safety. The preparation for their departure was a blur of silent efficiency. Mateo and his team loaded a few small bags into a nondescript SUV. The luxury sedans had been put away. For this final act, Junsok required invisibility. Junsok walked them to the courtyard. The morning fog was beginning to lift, revealing a sky the color of a bruised plum. The air was crisp, tasting of the coming winter. Minho stood by the car, looking back at the man who had saved his life twice, once as a boy in the gutters, and once as a king on the mountain. He reached out and gripped Junsok's forearm.
You could come with us, Minho whispered, a final desperate hope in his voice. You have the resources. You could leave all this behind. You don't have to be the boy in the cave anymore. Junsok looked at his old friend, then at the sprawling, cold fortress of the estate behind them. He thought of the blood on the warehouse floor and the thousands of lives that depended on his grip on the syndicate. He was a pillar of a world that would collapse if he moved. I am the cave, Minho, Junsok replied quietly. Go, before the sun finds us. Ha-Rin rubbed her eyes, blinking against the cool breeze. She looked at the SUV, then back at Junsok. She stepped forward and held out her hand, offering the jade tiger back to him. You need your luck, Mr. Park, she said, her voice clear and sweet. The shadow men are gone, but you're still here all by yourself. Junsok looked at the small carving. He gently pushed her hand back toward her. Keep it, Ha-Rin. It's a gift. It will remind you that you were brave enough to stop a monster and make him a man for a night. Ha-Rin smiled, a bright, fragile thing, and tucked the tiger into her pocket. She leaned in and hugged his leg briefly, a touch of warmth that felt like a brand through his trousers, before her father ushered her into the back seat. Junsok stood in the center of the Riverstone courtyard as the SUV's engine hummed to life. He watched the taillights fade into the gray mist of the mountain pass. He didn't move until the sound of the engine was swallowed by the wind. He was alone again. The heavy weight of his empire returned to his shoulders, familiar and cold. He looked at his hands. They were empty. He had saved the only people who truly knew his name, and in doing so, he had ensured he would never hear it spoken with affection again. He turned back toward the glass and steel fortress, his reflection in the windows looking sharper, harder, and more isolated than ever before. He had paid the price for their freedom with his own solitude. As the first ray of sun hit the peaks, Park Junsok walked back into the shadows of his palace, the king of a mountain that had never felt so high or so quiet. The SUV was a ghost in the rearview mirror, its taillights eventually flickering out like dying embers as it descended into the thick, silver veil of the mountain pass. Junsok stood motionless on the gravel of the high courtyard, the silence of the peaks rushing back to fill the space where the engine's hum had been. The morning was exceptionally cold, the kind of cold that seemed to crystallize the very air, turning his breath into plumes of white smoke that vanished into the mist. He looked down at his empty hand, the palm still tingling from the brief warm weight of the jade tiger before he had pushed it back into Ha-Rin's care. For 20 years, that stone had been his anchor, a reminder of a boy who had once survived on scraps and stubbornness. Now it was gone, traveling toward a life of sunlight and saltwater in Jeju, carried by a girl who would grow up knowing that even monsters could be reached. Mateo approached from the shadows of the garage, his footsteps crunching softly on the river stones. He stopped a respectful distance away, his eyes scanning the perimeter. The tactical gear was gone, replaced by the sharp, anonymous black suit of a high-level enforcer, but the lethal alertness remained. "The transport is clear of the first checkpoint, boss," Mateo reported, his voice low. "The trackers are active, but only on your private frequency. As far as the syndicate knows, the problem in the forest was incinerated at the warehouse." Junsok didn't turn around. He was watching the fog roll over the cliffside, a vast, undulating sea of gray that swallowed the world below. "And Choi Sang-hoon? He's quiet, for now, but he's lost his teeth in this district. The other families are already smelling the blood. They'll be calling for a meeting by sunset." Junsok finally turned, his face a mask of iron and shadow. The vulnerability that had cracked through his armor in the bunker was sealed away, buried beneath the weight of his responsibility. He was the apex predator again, the man whose name was a warning. But as he looked at Mateo, there was a new, cold clarity in his gaze. "Let them call," Junsok said, his voice as sharp as the mountain wind. "I am not interested in their politics. If they want to test the strength of my walls, let them remember what happened in the forest." He began to walk toward the main entrance of the estate, the glass and steel reflecting the pale, early light. He realized then that he was no longer at war with the man he had become. For a long time, he had viewed his ruthlessness as a curse, a necessary evil that had stripped him of his humanity. But as he thought of Ha-Rin safe in the back of that car and Min-ho given a second chance at life, he understood the truth. The world was a dark place, filled with shadow men who preyed on the weak and the innocent. Those people needed more than a hero. They needed a monster who was willing to hunt the other monsters. He was the barrier between the girl's lavender silk and the charcoal darkness of the underworld. He was the ghost of the mountain, a necessary nightmare. He reached the heavy glass doors of the estate. They slid open with a whisper of perfection, admitting him to the silent, temperature-controlled sanctuary of his empire. He walked through the halls, passing the Zen garden where the sand remained perfectly raked, undisturbed by the wind or the rain. He climbed the stairs to his study and sat in the high-backed chair. He didn't turn on the monitors, he didn't check the ledgers, he simply sat in the quiet, watching the sun finally break through the high peaks, turning the mist into a brilliant, blinding gold. He was alone, and he would likely remain alone until the end of his days. But for the first time in 2 decades, the loneliness didn't feel like a hollow ache, it felt like a duty, it felt like peace. He had saved the child, ended the debt, and accepted his place in the shadows. Park Kyun-sok leaned back, his eyes steady and unreadable as the world below woke up to a day that he had made safe for at least one small girl. The king was in his fortress, and the forest was quiet.